to the 19th.
All right, so welcome. Thank you for coming to my interview today. We're going to be talking about interviewing. So, one of the first things I want to model um, in that is asking permission. So, do I have your permission to interview you today?
Yes, you do.
Okay, we are being recorded, both audio and video. Um, just a quick introduction. This is Kate Hobgood Guthrie. She is an assistant professor of educational research methodology. Is that not the right?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. At Piedmont College. And she also happens to share a last name as well as a house with me. Um, and she is an expert in qualitative methodology, which includes a lot about researching. But I really want to let her tell that part um, of the story. So, for to just kick us off, why don't you tell us about sort of your background as it relates to interviewing?
So yeah, currently what I do is educational research, and there are different approaches to research. There's often quantitative research, qualitative research. There's other approaches such as arts-based or action research. Part of what I do and what my background is in terms of qualitative research, involves accessing information from people using an roughly an interpersonal relationship, a conversation, a discussion. So I came to this. I was a classroom teacher for a while. I was a classroom teacher about 5, 6 years, and then was decided that that was a very difficult thing, and moved into educational research at the University of Georgia. A lot of what I try to do with my research is, while we can gather certain findings and perspectives from a quantitative perspective. The qualitative perspective is a little bit more about the stories. It's about the stories of people here in terms of education in the schools or in the classrooms, on those types of experiences. And most of my research, because it is qualitative, involves interviewing. Interviewing is one of the primary methods of data collection. And sometimes I think we assume that there's really just one style of interviewing. There's actually multiple and many styles, and it can be as varied and exciting as you want it to be, or it can be as scriptive and structured and constrained as you want. A lot of my research involves semi structured, in depth interviewing. So if there's a continuum of structured, whereas I have, excuse me, I have these questions, I'm going to ask these questions in this order, and I'm not going to stray from this interview guide, to unstructured, I'm coming to this interview with no questions prepared. I'm just kind of see how the conversation goes. Semi-structured usually lands somewhere in the middle. It's kind of coming to the interview with a plan, with a set of questions, but then allowing the conversation to naturally unfold, so that perhaps there are other questions that need to be asked, or you ask the questions in a different order based on how your participant or how the interviewee responds. So most of my research is, or I use semi-structured in-depth interviews and also group interviews. I will sometimes interview adolescents for much of my research, which can be a little bit of a challenge, but most of my work is also with adults. So is
Awesome.
that a good enough background?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
All right, so the next thing we want to talk about is interview design.
Mm.
So when you're thinking about, things like does the particular interview that I'm doing, does it need the full structure, or can I be more unstructured? Like, what are the things that you need to do to design a quality interview?
I think it really depends on your goal. Um, if you know you have a set amount of time and you know you want to get through all of your questions, you may want to design it so it's a little bit more structured. But know that as soon as it becomes a little bit more structured, you're going to lose a sense of natural conversation that will happen. And for my work, it's a lot about meaning making and how we make meaning of things, and then also how we communicate those things. And if you want it to, if you want, I think the interviewee to feel like they can speak in their voice and have the freedom to go down a little rabbit hole if they want. I mean, it's your job as the interviewer to kind of pull them back out of that rabbit hole. But I usually encourage people, the semi-structured approach tends to work best if you have a plan, but you also want to save space for what that person is going to bring into that interview space. And so, in terms of design, if you want to design something semi structured, it is coming in with a plan, coming in with a set of questions. Um, I do recommend, in terms of what those questions are, that you have a warm up question. Oftentimes, when we come into a conversation, especially from an interview and interviewee, there's already a power dynamic that's at play. And there may be other power dynamics that are also played, not just the interview relationship, but perhaps even the topic that you're studying or the age of the participants, the race of, not, I say participants because I'm in the research world, um, the age of you yourself and your interviewee, even gender, race, all of that will come into play in this social interaction. And so a warm-up question can be really nice because if you design a warm-up question appropriately, it should be a question that's really easy for them to answer, something that they don't really have to think about, but will start to lead into what you actually want to talk about. If you want to think of like an interview in the midst of a curve, you want the rich meaning, you want to kind of, or I'll probably an inverted curve. You want that rich, those rich responses and that rich conversation to happen. You want it to happen. It probably won't start out extremely rich. You're going to have to kind of warm them up to get them there. So warm up question can be really nice, and use it as a warm up question. And then have, depending on how long your interview is, have a set number of questions on certain topics that are really geared towards what it is you're really interested in listening or hearing about or exploring or capturing. Sometimes your questions can be about experiences or behaviors. It can be about their opinions or their values. You can ask questions about their feelings. You know, when this happened, what did it feel like? Knowledge questions. There are sensory questions. When you walked into that conference room, what was the first thing you saw? Anything that kind of, again, continue to probe or inquire about whatever topic it is you're talking to them about. And then there's also background and demographic questions, which Dr. Guthrie here led with in terms of the warm-up question was my background. And that's something I didn't really have to think about. It's easy for me to answer, but it did kind of get me to the point now where I can talk for a while. And probably notice he's doing a good job of listening. He's not interrupting, but he is giving me a little bit of positive feedback in terms of he's smiling, he's nodding his head, he's communicating to me nonverbally that he's listening, which is something that's really important to do once you get to those moments where you have some of those rich responses. And then with those questions, it's important to have some probes and even a structure of a probe. So a probing question is a question that will guide them a little bit deeper or ask something a little bit more. Even a structure of a probe, such as you mentioned such and such. Can you tell us a little bit more about such and such? And having that like plan for at least one of those probes every now and then will be really helpful. And it's your job as the interviewer to have, you're multitasking, you're actively listening, you're making sure you're getting your questions answered, but to be able to pinpot those pin spot, pin spot, pinpoint, that's the word, pinpoint those moments that it's actually that you want to hear about, so you can kind of guide them back and probe um, into that topic more in depth. And then I usually recommend, just as you start off with a warm-up question, you need to kind of leave them with a bookending question or like a conclusion question, something that kind of brings them back into the experience here. A standard question I usually ask is, I have two. I'll either ask, what was your biggest takeaway from our conversation? And sometimes I'm really surprised at their answers. Or I'll ask, was there anything that you thought I would have asked about that I didn't? Or is there anything else that you'd like to add? My questions bring anything else up? And it kind of pulls back, gives you that doorway out to exit the conversation, yet still keeps it relevant. And sometimes it's those little opportunities for interviewees to offer up those their additional insights can be really fruitful.
Awesome. All right. Last question, and you've touched on this a little bit. What are some of the ethical considerations that, as interviewers, we need to think about? So, like when you were talking about, power dynamics between, just people of different backgrounds, but certainly of different genders, different races, um, being interviewed in a job interview type of a setting. And also, about we talked about a little bit about, warming someone up, preparing them, getting them prepared. But what are some of the other like ethical things that we need to keep in mind to be both like skilled interviewers, but also ethical interviewers?
That's a great question. Um, you always want to lead with consent, uh, asking permission to be interviewed. In the research world, we usually have a form that they sign in some form that just kind of helps to
Right. We
document
we
that
will
they've
as
consent.
well.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I would ask for consent, and to also not let that even that consent form can start to create a different conversation. Let me sign this dotted line before we even come into a conversation, which can automatically right there, there's a power dynamic. You as the interviewer have more power than the interviewee. And so it's in this relationship, it's not necessarily that power won't exist, but it's important to be really mindful of it and to be mindful of how you approach it. I could come into situations as a really like staunch researcher I where I just see as collecting data, all I want is my transcript from you. Or I could come into this as a human being who's also going to have another conversation with another human being. So sometimes uh, little things like the tone of voice I use, asking them to call me by my first name. Sometimes I'm really mindful of the clothing that I wear in terms of if I'm working with adolescents, or I'll try to wear a little bit more casual clothing, not a formal name tag, so I don't scream someone with authority. Um, Other things that can help in that power dynamic is as the interviewer to have a little bit of a kind of sit back a little bit, lean back away from the space rather than kind of leaning into the space. I know if you've got like a microphone, you might be leaning into a microphone. It's important to ask if there are any direct identifiable information, if they share names of other things, if you want those names shared, or if those need to be adjusted to pseudonyms. If you're also capturing video, you want to make sure that they understand that you're going to be capturing audio and video, and whether or not you keep both, you just need to let them know. Trying to think if there's any other like in terms of just the overall interview process. I mean, there's lots of other ethical things, but um,
No, that's really good.
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much
You're
for your
welcome.
time. I can tell you that Kate has vast experience in this area and could teach us all a lot for several
I was like,
hours. But
how do I talk about it in
yeah,
10 minutes? Is that
yeah.
possible?
But awesome. This is great. It's a great start. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Thanks for listening. You can listen to more episodes and find resources for teaching podcasting at podcastpedagogy.com. You can email the show at info@podcastpedagogy.com.